Now it's time for Nostalgia Town, where we speak with well-known older Australians about the journey they took that makes them the person they are today.
Dr. Elizabeth Farrelly is a columnist, essayist, novelist, critic and speaker. Trained in architecture, science and philosophy, she is fascinated by how humans engage with nature to make culture. For over 30 years, her Sydney Morning Herald column on urbanism, planting, climate, politics and public art has seen city making go from back page news to headline material. I'm Patricia Amphlett and I'm joined with...
Lex Marinos.
And here we are with lovely Elizabeth Farrelly. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
You too. And you're from Dunedin in New Zealand originally. What brought you to Australia?
Oh, well, coming to Australia was a bit of a story for me. It wasn't what I intended. I mean, I just went to live in London as everyone did back in the day. So I grew up mostly in Auckland, in fact, and, started off studying medicine and then decided to study philosophy and then decided to study architecture and then practiced architecture for a bit. So I was a bit older than most people by the time I leapt off the edge of the country into the old Europe. And I was 27, so not that old. And I worked I didn't actually work in London. At first I thought, London's too big, can't cope. And it's too ugly. I thought London was really ugly, something wrong with my eyes at that stage. I think it was winter. And so I went to Bristol, took a job in Bristol and thought, you know what, Bristol's near the sea. I like the sea. And of course, it's not really near the sea. Anyway, after about a month, I went running back to London because Bristol was too boring and everyone went to bed at 6 o'clock at night, apparently. Yeah, so I took another job and a few more jobs, actually. And then after about a year in London, I ended up more or less falling into a job as an editor, assistant editor of the Architectural Review. So I was working as an architect and I got fed up with this is very me. I was having a drink one evening in the summer with one of my old professors, Alan Wilde, who had actually been the Dean of Architecture in Auckland. He was over there on some Commonwealth board or other. And we were having a glass of wine and I was having a whinge about the end of year show at the AA in London, which is a very prestigious kind of international independent architecture school where all the rich people went, and people like Zaha Hadid were teaching there, I think, at the time. And I thought, I kept saying, this is just, it's fatuous and it's silly and it's not real architecture. And he said, well, don't talk to me about it, write it down and send it to someone. So I did. And I was immediately sort of published not on the front page, but on the kind of inside front page of a thing called Building Design, which was a weekly rag. And in London, and so I was kind of notorious suddenly because I didn't realize that no one does that. No one is critical, especially not a colonial. You just don't lob into somewhere and tell them that they're rubbish. And so, on the strength of that, really, I was more or less offered a job at the Architectural Review in London, and I worked there for a few years before realizing that you sort of had to come home and couldn't quite stomach the idea of going back to New Zealand, which was so small. So I thought Sydney seemed like a good compromise between the kind of Antipodean dream, if you like, and the big world, which I was still in love with.
And it seems that since that time, you and Sydney have had a love-hate relationship with one another. Yeah. I must admit, Elizabeth, one of the things that fascinates me about Sydney is having come here from the country, a regional area, about 60-odd years ago. When I first moved here, I was struck by the amount of building that was going on, and that never seems to have stopped. Is there an end point? Will Sydney ever be finished? And is that common for large cities around the world? I don't get that feeling in other large cities. Sydney feels to me to be continually under construction.
Yeah, look, I think you're right. It is. And in some ways that's a good thing because, a city is a living organism in a way. And it probably what you don't want is an end point. But I think the way Sydney does it has always been reckless, really. We fail to understand, much less value our own heritage and what we've already got, and what the beauty, and in many cases, of what we've already made, not just the beauty of the natural attributes of Sydney. And so we kind of whop it down and start again with gay abandon, when it would be much more sensible and much more lovable as a result if we could be a bit gentler with ourselves and a bit more loving towards what we've made already, I think. So, and I think that's what good cities do. And maybe that's just, a new culture. And I think the cultural insecurity of being, as it were, white Australia and not really having come to terms with all of that background properly. And so there's, we have a lot of guilt stuff. And I think that often manifests as a sort of anger towards our environment.